Hey everybody, this is a book. This is the introduction, the introduction to the book, Open Marxism, Critical Theory as Militant Enlightenment by Christos Memos. The contents of the book are Introduction, Marxian Theory as an Chapter 1, Marxian Theory as an Open-Ended Project. Chapter 2, quote, Marx was not an orthodox Marxist, and quote, the critique of institutional Marxism. Chapter 3, quote, Working and Struggling with Marx, and quote, Critique, Social Forms and Praxis. 4, Dispelling the Statist Myth of Socialism on Party and State Forms. Chapter 5, A Critical Theory of Class, Labor, and Economics. Chapter 6, Open Marxism as Critical Social Theory and the Struggle for a New Global Human Condition. Here we are. So this video is going to be the introduction. Introduction. Open Marxism is a heterodox Marxist critical social theory as a heterodox Marxist critical social theory, Jesus Christ, comprises a long and varied tradition of thought, which developed as a fundamental and negative critique of the post-Second World War capitalism. At the same time, open Marxism evolved from the critique of institutional Marxism and statist forms of socialism, and was articulated as a critical response to the dual universal decline of social democracy and Leninism-Stalinism. The communality between the diverse approaches within the open Marxist tradition is founded on the experience of orthodox Marxism, either directly as orthodox Marxism emerged in the Eastern European countries, or indirectly through the dominance of orthodox Marxist political organizations or thought in Western European countries. This shared experience and the communality of opposition to both capitalism and institutional Marxism proved vital for the formulation of their heterodox thought and for its practical consequences. Open Marxism's development exemplified an attempt within the history of the socialist movement to, quote, wrest tradition away from the conformism that is working to overpower it, end quote. Benjamin. And reconcile, quote, proletarian democracy and socialism, freedom and revolution, end quote. Godin. It's Daniel Godin. Or Danielle. Danielle, I guess is how you say it. It's how you'd say it in a shitty French accent, like the one that I can muster. However, open Marxism's critical theory remained largely neglected, mainly due to the force of its negative and subversive critique of capitalism, and because it evolved from the practical and theoretical critiques, experiences, and struggles that has resulted from head-on confrontation with official and institutional Marxism. Despite its indubitable importance and valuable contributions, open Marxism has been overshadowed by intellectual and fashionable, quote, Marxist trends, which played into the interests of the academic industry, and state and party apparatuses. As a result, the critical theory of the open Marxist tradition has fallen into obscurity, and its original texts are scattered far and wide, and are often quite inaccessible to, quote, uninitiated audiences. This book aims to critically reconstruct and scrutinize open Marxism as an unorthodox, heretical, and dissident critical Marxist current that united scholars from both Western and Eastern Europe during the post-Second World War period. Footnote. God damn, I hate this. I hate endnotes. Endnotes are the dumbest thing in the world. For the love of Christ. I go all the way to the back of this bitch. Okay, footnote. The, quote, open Marxist tradition is not related in any way to what is sometimes misleadingly referred to as Gramsci's, quote, open Marxism. This misunderstanding arose from the title of Karl Marzani's edited volume, The Open Marxism of Antonio Gramsci, published in 1957. In using this term, Marzani meant that Gramsci was a Marxist, a thinker, quote, with an open mind, end quote. not an open Marxist proper. It's an open Marxist in capital letters. End footnote. The study offers a novel and systematic overview and analysis of the open Marxist tradition and follows its evolution from the initial usage and significance of the term by Costas Axelos in France in the 1950s and the journal Argument circle, namely the quote, anarchist Marxism quote, of Maximilien Rubel and the quote, libertarian Marxism of Daniel Guérin. Through open Marxism, as it was developed in Eastern Europe, especially in the scholarly work of Karol Kozak in Czechoslovakia, and the work of the Polish open Marxists in the Praxis Group in Yugoslavia, Petrovich, Stojanovic, Markovic, Kongrega, I don't know if I'm saying that right, to Johannes Agnoli's work in the post-68 West Germany, and finally to the work developed by Simon Clark, Werner Bonefeld, John Holloway, Richard Gunn, within the framework of the Conference of Socialist Economists in Britain since the 1980s. The main aim of the book is to highlight how open Marxism as a part of the tradition of Militant Enlightenment can contribute to the renewal of critical social theory through its subversive critique of both capitalist society and institutional Marxism as party and state ideology. The study represents a critical attempt to reclaim, comprehend, and reinvigorate a, quote, subterranean strand of critical theory, end quote, and a very significant intellectual and subversive heritage of the critical Marxist tradition, which could help us to make sense of the downfall and failures of institutional Marxism and the traditional left, and also to make our critique of capitalism more powerful and radical. What exactly is open Marxism? Does open Marxism constitute a school, a heterogeneous group of scholars, a stream, a current, or a tendency within the broader critical Marxist tradition? If it is addressed in this manner, the question, quote, what is open Marxism, appears to be a rather delimiting and definitional attempt to create a, quote, static, fragmented, reified isness, end quote. That is an endeavor to outline a, quote, definitional world, end quote, quote, a clean world, a, quote, world of clear divisions, a world of exclusion, end quote. John Holloway. In a similar vein, and in an effort to go beyond a rigid categorization and systematization of open Marxism, Hugo Radis aptly argued, quote, I have never been entirely happy with the idea of, quote, schools, because they tend to become like elements of the larger structure of, quote, academic disciplines, end quote. Often the most interesting problems are found in the borderlands between them, so it is vital to ensure that those borders are, quote, open. You can see a dialectic at work here between the, quote, purity of the school, fending off opponents, mounting counterattacks, and the need for self-criticism as an essential part of a critical approach, end quote. Hugo Radis. On this basis, open Marxism does not comprise a school in the academic sense of the word, nor does open Marxism form a homogeneous body of doctrines and a closed system of thought. If open Marxism is to be perceived as a historical and theoretical collective undertaking of any kind, then it represents a collective movement of critical thought, and it is a community, a distinctive community of critical theorists. As such, it has developed organically over about the last 70 years in the work of certain critical scholars and groups, and acquired its proper theoretical contours through direct engagement with the social movements, political explosions, and social uprisings as they have emerged in the struggles against both capitalism and Stalinism in the West and the East, respectively. The uprisings of 1953 in East Germany, of 1956 in Poland and Hungary, the Prague Spring in 1968, the movements of the 1960s in the advanced capitalist countries, the attempts to make sense of and struggle against Thatcherism and neoliberalism, and the final disintegration of the social regimes in Eastern Europe in 1991, and the pulverization of Marxism-Leninism in all its institutional variants, could shed light on and explain the historical, social, and political context of the development of open Marxist critical theory. In a letter to the editors of his later writings, Kozak made a noteworthy point which delineates the perspective from which the open Marxist scholars expounded their critical theory. Quote, I am convinced that for French As well as for Spanish readers, it could be interesting and illuminating to see the continuity of my thought, which means to see the critique of Stalinism together with the critique of contemporary capitalism, or better put, of capitalist restoration, end quote. Karol Kosik, quoted in Louvi 2022. Arguably situating open Marxists in the historical and political context of their struggle and subversive critique of both capitalism and Stalinism, and taking account of the experience of the fight against fascism in the 1940s of certain open Marxist scholars, Axelos, Kosik, the Polish Marxists and the Praxis members, and even the, quote, peculiar negative experience of Agnoli in associating with fascism in Italy and fighting on the side of the German army, would better illuminate their intellectual and political itinerary. It would also better demonstrate what was and is at stake in advancing an open Marxist critical theory of society. These political and existential experiences constitute a landmark in the formation process of the open Marxist critiques, which must be considered to be the theoretical expression of the actual movement of struggles against fascism, capitalism, Stalinism, and social democracy. The book provides a comprehensive analysis of the historical development of the open Marxist approach in all its various guises and forms, in which the term, quote, open came to have several different meanings. First, for Axelos, Kosik, and certain strands of open Marxism in Eastern Europe, the label, quote, open came to mean an openness of Marxism to a creative dialogue with other philosophical traditions, particularly with phenomenology and existentialism, and various forms of humanism. This openness also meant an open reassessment and rethinking of deliberately overlooked and ignored Marxist thinkers and traditions in other Eastern European forms of open Marxism. The openness involved a call to open Marxism to traditional sociological methods and empirical research into the study of new social phenomenon. Marxist tenets were perceived to be open to confirmation, verification, and validation as proper scientific principles. Second, for the whole body of open Marxist thinkers, openness was understood as a theoretical and political undertaking that resisted, radically questioned, and was vehemently opposed to the various forms of closed and dogmatic Marxist orthodoxy that served as state and party ideology. Openness was seen as a humanist alternative to Stalinism and as autonomy from the established and institutional forms of Marxism, including its Althusserian and structuralist variants. Third, a current of open Marxism, Rubel, Guarin, Agnoli, and the CSE scholars understood the term, quote, open as an openness to the rather unknown and libertarian Marx. That is, Marx is a fierce critic of state and money against the transformation of Marxism into statist ideology. This approach gave rise to the idea of a, quote, anarchist Marx, and through the lens of a libertarian communism, had the opening of Marxism to anarchism and vice versa as its objective. Thus, it was an openness that aimed explicitly or implicitly to achieve a synthesis between Marxism and anarchism. Finally, a fourth approach, Agnoli and the CSE critical theorist, construed the term, quote, open as openness to the inner nature of social phenomena, to their genesis, constitution, and dynamic process. This is an openness of concepts and categories to the social relations of production, to lived experience, to human practice that seeks to engage with the open-ended and often unpredictable results of the class antagonism between capital and labor, and it was also seen as an openness to the practical experiences of past libertarian and anti-authoritarian social struggles for human emancipation, to historically developed social relations, and to the experience of the contradictory character of societal reality. One moment, please. Sorry, I know this is annoying. Just need to copy this down. Without neglecting the differences between the various trends and open Marxist scholars, the study holds that what is important is not to stress the disparities by drawing dividing lines, but to mark out the lines of continuity, convergence, and critical synthesis in such a way that the aspects of the specific arguments, quote, interweave as in a carpet, end quote, and all the different positions are presented, quote, in such a way that they support one another, that each one articulates itself according to the configurations that it forms with the others, end quote. Adorno. The study endeavors to distill open Marxism's shared arguments and points of critique and situate them in their historical and political context in order that we become more critically aware and reflective about the conditions in which open Marxists originally made their mark. Given their considerable differences, the aim of this study is to expose and underscore the most radical aspects of their theorizing, particularly those that could help to enrich and reformulate a powerful and subversive critical theory of capitalism in order to pave the way forward towards a free and open socialist society. There is a discernible common foundation to the work of these authors, which, along with its more other shared features, contributes to the distinctiveness of open Marxism. The most distinct feature of open Marxism concerns open Marxism's critique and rejection of orthodox Marxism as a mirror image of the alienated capitalist form of society. This common ground that has united open Marxists emerged and developed from their devastating critique of social democracy, the state ideology of Leninism, Stalinism, and Soviet Marxism, and from their critical confrontation with other currents of institutional Marxism, including the Althusserian structuralist paradigm and the attempts of conformist Marxism to formalize and reduce Marxist concepts to an academic idiom, thus making them academically respectable. The critique of the prevailing Marxist orthodoxy that was formulated by the open Marxist critical theorists helps us understand that the crises of official Marxism and its eventual breakdown constituted social and historical products of certain tendencies and developments that were evident throughout its history and are the final outcome of the direction in which the ideology of Marxism-Leninism was seeking to move. With the disintegration of the Soviet Union, quote, Marxism-Leninism had evaporated as a dominant ideology. Orthodox Marxism, the, quote, unsurpassable philosophy of our time, end quote, as Sartre once called it, has gone up in smoke. With the fall of the regime came the fall of the concept of Marxism as science, the technicians of the Leninist Party, and the, quote, professional Marxists of the state apparatuses. The final disintegration of the social regimes in Eastern Europe in 1991 and the pulverization of Marxism-Leninism had a catalytic effect within the socialist and communist movement worldwide. It was the demise of a socialist system that claimed to represent Marxist thought and establish a socialist society. Its downfall and the ensuing aftermath had dire political and theoretical consequences and triggered enormous political changes that amounted to the dissolution of the majority of traditional communist and left parties on a global scale. Even 30-plus years later, the 1991 collapse continues to have formidable political and theoretical implications, which reinforce decisively the multilateral social regression and the further pacification and domestication of social struggles and political conflicts. It constrains and blocks any attempt to form a radical socialist alternative to capitalism, as the vast majority of people who live from the sale of their labor power associate socialism with Stalinism and the related unfreedom, oppression, untruth, and fear. Arguably, the idea of socialism has been defamed and irreparably damaged and has been turned into a curse and anathema. In the West, Eurocommunism as a political and theoretical trend has also vanished, and what was left of traditional social democracy has lost its distinctive political and theoretical features, and so-called social democratic parties have moved to even more right-wing and conservative positions. Since the 1980s, and against the background of Althusser's public announcement of the crisis of Marxism in 1977, open Marxists have fiercely opposed and criticized the Althusserian structuralist paradigm. We're asking people, quote, not to take Althusserianism at face value and not to read Marx, end quote. Quote, not to take Althusserianism at face value, unquote, and not to read Marx through Althusser, but instead to, quote, read Marx for Marx, read Marx before for Marx, the book by Althusser. Read Capital before reading Capital, end quote. Simon Clark. In this sense, the recovery and critical reconstruction of the open Marxist tradition can be construed as part of the very difficult but much needed undertaking to repair the damage that has been done to the idea of socialism by the distorted, oppressive, and statist forms of socialism as they emerged during the 20th century. Castoriadis was quite right when Castoriadis commented with reference to the downfall of orthodox Marxism that, quote, search as one might, it is impossible to find a historical analogy to this pulverization of what seemed yesterday a steel fortress, end quote. Castoriadis. I have Memos' book on Castoriadis on the channel if you're interested. However paradoxical and unexpected it may appear today, this collapse of institutional Marxism, or, quote, the decomposition of Marxism, end quote, which Sorel had foreseen as early as 1908, was neither illogical or uninterpretable. The continuous succession of crises in the various forms of institutional Marxism and the final collapse should neither be hypostatized nor disconnected from the social and historical context. The transformation of the Marxian critical theory into a reified party and state ideology and Marxian critical theory's reduction to dead categories and a stereotypical phraseology used by technocrats and bureaucrats was dependent on certain class and power struggles and was the outcome of a long-term social process of struggles, tensions, and conflicts. By the same token, the breakdown of orthodox and established Marxism can only be explicated if it is explained and unraveled as a dynamic and not a static phenomenon, as becoming and not as being. The validity of critical theory of society is confirmed when the crisis and dilapidation of Marxism is construed in the context and process of their becoming. As Adorno noted, quote, being is becoming in disguise, end quote, and what, quote, appears to be should be conceived as something that has come to be, end quote. And what, quote, appears to be should be conceived as something that has come to be, end quote. Adorno. The sudden collapse has something that came to be. The sudden collapse was something that came to be. The sudden collapse was the apogee of various intense and concentrated crises and transformations of orthodox Marxism, which in turn had been mediated by the historically specific social relations of production and social conditions. Open Marxism's critique of dogmatic, established, and structural Marxism implied a return to critical thinking, which in turn entailed a return to Marx. It amounted to a subversive critique and demystification, decipherment and demythologization of the social forms of capitalist society, and of all ideologies and mythologies, including socialism, Marxism, and Marx. It revealed the deeply anti-democratic and anti-socialist character of the Stalinist order, and in doing so called for a thorough re-examination and critical analysis of deep-seated questions concerning socialist ideas and their relation to Marxist theory. Theoretical and practical issues, which were once considered obvious and closed subjects because they had been part of the solidified state religion and the, quote, Marxist-Leninist, end quote, ideology of traditional left politics, ceased to be self-evident truths and obvious dogmatic beliefs and re-emerge as crucial and vital theoretical and political questions. Certain assumptions and presuppositions of closed and dogmatic orthodox Marxism could neither be taken for granted nor endorsed uncritically. As Karol Kosik argued, quote, in every crisis, everything is again theoretically examined and analyzed, and things that once seemed to be resolved and clear have long ceased to be obvious and appear problematical. That is, as vital questions that must forever and always be examined and analyzed, end quote. Karol Kosik. Open Marxism's subversive critique of the basic tenets of institutional Marxism was deployed as the critique and rejection of the, quote, holy schema and, quote, universal framework of the base superstructure model, of the Althusserian distinction between the young and old Marx, and of the idea and use of dialectics in its mystified form as a tool of an apologetic ideology and as a legitimating mechanism of the Stalinist regimes. This shared consistent and distinctive critique of traditional theory and Marxist orthodoxy was coupled with the critical rereading of Marx's critical theory. This return and distinctive rereading of Marx constituted a second common core feature that made the open Marxist approach unique and distinctive. This reinterpretation and further elaboration of Marxist thought considered Marxian categories to be open, dialectical, and critical categories and highlighted the most libertarian and anti-authoritarian aspects of Marx's work. The common theme of this return to Marx constituted a radical rethinking of the meaning of critique, not as a normative and constructive critique, but as a negative, fundamental, and destructive one. Dialectics was understood as a subversive method of critique and as the destruction of mystification that aims to disclose the reified social forms and expose them as historical formations of human praxis. The concept of, quote, social form analysis and the dialectics of form/content, appearance/essence imply that the starting point for open Marxism critical theory is not the economic base of capitalist society nor any other structure. According to the open Marxist approach, the only foundation for the deployment of critical social theory is the contradictory and historically developed social relations which characterize a particular form of society. That is the sum total of capitalist relations of production, and therefore the task of negative critique is to criticize the historically specific forms in which capitalist social relations present themselves, thus revealing capitalist social relations as the product and result of human practice. Open Marxism's, quote, struggling and working, end quote, with Marx, and the, quote, social form, end quote, analysis provide a lens through which to comprehend contradictory tendencies and antagonistic social relations and critically analyze and explore the historical possibilities of reviving emancipatory politics. It is their argument for and insistence on self-determination as the ends and means of negative critique that constitute another core feature of established a foundation and common ground for the work of the open Marxist thinkers. This work involved consideration of their critical undertaking to dispel the statist myth of socialism and embark on a radical critique of the form of both the state and the party. This shared negative critique of political forms implied a penetrating critique of dogmatism, heteronomy, and delusion, and at the same time entailed a thoroughgoing critical theory of class, labor, and economics. From this perspective, the study argues that the open Marxist tradition expounded and further advanced the critical purpose of the early Frankfurt School and the subversive critical theory in the direction of critical confrontation with traditional theory and positivism, maintaining a critical strand, which originally manifested as critique of the traditional theory and of the prevailing positivism and scientificism of the Marxist tradition of the Second and Third Internationals. Open Marxism constituted one of the most radical attempts to critique the mechanistic interpretations of Marxism and any form of evolutionism, as well as naturalized conceptualizations of history and society. Moment. Open Marxists engaged in a critical and creative dialogue with the early Frankfurt School, and the development of the open Marxist tradition has to be understood as a process of critical interaction with the works of Adorno, Marcuse, and Horkheimer, and with the thinking of the second generation of critical theorists such as Alfred Schmidt, Hans-Georg Backhaus, and Helmut Reichelt. This critical engagement includes the translation and dissemination of the writings by open Marxist scholars, personal correspondence and meetings, in particular the Kula Summer School, organized by the members of the Praxis Group, act as a critical public space that enabled the transmission of ideas between Eastern and Western European critical open Marxists and certain members of the first and second generations of the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. The book focuses on the ways in which the open Marxist tradition advanced critical theory forward, with regard to the negative critique of capitalism and the critique of political economy as critical social theory. At the same time, by drawing on the writings of the early Frankfurt School critical theorists, it critically discusses and elaborates on the open Marxist theorist critical insights. It is one of the key arguments of this book that we need to enhance the tradition of radical and militant enlightenment and the revolutionary imperative by combining together the open Marxist tradition with the early critical theory, the critique of political economy, the critique of political economy and other critical and dissident Marxist traditions, counsel communism and anarchism, with the objective of creating a powerful fusion of theoretical and political experience and paving the way forward for class struggle in the fight against capitalism. The Marxian critical theory and the socialist and communist traditions that have developed over the last 150 years cannot be perceived as isolated from the project of enlightenment that has marked the history of modernity, especially when modernity is understood as a, quote, qualitative and not, quote, a chronological category, end quote. Adorno. The socialist project is not separated from capitalist modernity. The socialist project is a product of this modernity, and as such, the socialist project has been largely enmeshed in the dominant ideology and by extension has been permeated by what Adorno and Horkheimer called the dialectic of the Enlightenment. Quote, the dialectic of the Enlightenment, end quote, according to Horkheimer, quote, consists largely in the change from light to darkness, end quote. And it is also characterized by, quote, the change from truth unto, the, quote, change from truth into unconditional conformity with meaninglessness, end quote. This danger of moving from light to darkness and sinking into new forms of barbarism does not only apply to the capitalist mode of production. Unfortunately, as the history, practice, and policies of Stalinism and social democracy have shown, the return to barbarism appears to be a possibility and part of the socialist project and tradition. I mean, I don't know what precisely he's referring to here, but I would not put social democracy into the same category of barbarism as Stalinism. The historically formulated and still very topical question of, quote, socialism or barbarism excludes from the very outset any possibility of barbarism within the various forms of socialism as they emerged and became established during the 20th century. Akin to capitalism, wars, murders, military invasion, and the occupation of other countries, colonization and imperialism, forced labor camps, violence, unfreedom, racism, sexism, bigotry, and religious intolerance and persecution, the violation of fundamental liberties and human rights, and the poverty of a, quote, anti-liberalism which fell short of liberalism, end quote. Fine. Were all indicators of what appeared to be, quote, actually existing socialism, end quote. In the last century contained within it the possibility of a return to barbarism. What must be of key concern in the struggle for a liberating and socialist alternative to capitalism is that, as the history of the socialist tradition shows, there is a, quote, permanent possibility of relapse, end quote. Adorno. The possibility of regression is always there, and the, quote, relapse into barbarism is always an option, end quote. Adorno and Horkheimer. In one of his letters to Thomas Mann of 1952, Adorno characteristically noted that the origins of the, quote, spreading barbarism, end quote, and disaster, quote, cannot be sought simply in the developmental tendencies of bourgeois society, but can also be traced to the characteristic outlook of its critics, end quote. In this sense, certain, quote, positivist elements, end quote, that exist in Marxist thought and the bourgeois influences that can be found in orthodox Marxism anticipated the, quote, way in which socialism itself would eventually become another part of the machinery of production, end quote. Against the background of the downfall of the Eastern European regimes, the disintegration of institutional Marxism and the decay of left-wing politics on the one hand, and the social regression and the ongoing multifaceted crisis of capitalism on the other hand, the book examines open Marxism's contribution to the tradition of critical, progressive, and militant enlightenment. It considers the open Marxist account that, quote, critiques enlightening intent is to make visible what is hidden in things, end quote. Bonafelt constitutes and maintains the, quote, embarrassment which the militant enlightenment causes contemporary philosophy, end quote, due to its, quote, positivistic stance, end quote, superficiality, end quote, and neglect of the, quote, constitutive elements, end quote, of social phenomena, excuse me. Horkheimer. This is part of progressive enlightenment's effort to represent the truth in its struggles against social, political, economic, and ideological powers. The book argues that the open Marxist tradition can forcefully advance the, quote, potential for enlightenment, for intellectual maturity, end quote, the possibility of becoming conscious of social processes instead of simply accepting social processes without reflection, end quote, Adorno. Against the, quote, bourgeois superficiality, end quote, which, quote, instead of getting to the bottom of things, prefers to ascribe everything to nature, or rather to an unchanging character, end quote, Horkheimer. Open Marxism has expounded one of the distinctive elements of the Enlightenment. That is, the, quote, recognition that whatever claimed intrinsic being or independent existence in itself had actually emerged and come to be what it is over the course of time, end quote. Adorno. Akin to the traditions of militant enlightenment, and in particular of early Frankfurt critical theory, the subversive critique of open Marxism has as its main objective to, quote, see through the semblance of autonomy of that which is made by us. It is the human being who produces everything that appears as autonomous in itself, end quote. Adorno. Inspired by critical enlightenment as reductio ad hominem, open Marxism's critique is substantiated as disenchantment, decipherment, and demythologization from all the estranged forms and abstractions which reified human practice exerts over human beings and social relations. New section, Scope and Structure. This is the first book-length work to bring together the various heterodox traditions, groups, and scholars that came under the heading of open Marxism, reflect upon open Marxism's renewal of critical social theory, and critically discuss the practical relevance of its subversive thinking to the contemporary struggles for human emancipation and a new global human condition. It sets out how open Marxism develops the work of the early Frankfurt School in ways that significantly advance critical social theory as a negative critique of capitalist society, and explains how open Marxism's subversive negation of the capitalist social relations and radical critique of capitalism's various perverted social forms constitute a vital contribution to building radical social praxis and advancing the project of militant enlightenment. The study describes at length the distinctive common features of the open Marxist tradition, in particular its negative critique of capitalist society and institutional Marxism, its unique rereading and use of Marx and its subversive critique of class, labor, political economy, and the state and party forms. The study argues that the development of the open Marxist tradition, with negativity and class struggle at its center, has the potential to revitalize emancipatory social praxis and social struggles for a society of the free and equal. The book is organized thematically and in relation to the areas in which open Marxism's contribution has been most significant for the critical understanding of global capitalist society and the decline of the traditional left. The aim is to reveal and highlight the most radical and revolutionary aspects of open Marxism's theorizing, those that have the potential to open new horizons for critical theory and help us reformulate a more subversive and powerful critical theory of capitalism. The book comprises 6 chapters. The first chapter charts the development of the different strands of open Marxism and clarifies the different meanings ascribed to the term, quote, open. It starts with the open Marxist stream that emerged in France in the 1950s and includes the work of Axelos and the journal Argument Circle, mainly the work of Rubel and Guerin. It focuses next on the group's tendencies and scholars that comprise the open Marxist tradition in Eastern Europe, that is, the writings of the Praxis group in Yugoslavia, the Polish open Marxist, and the scholarly work of Kosik in Czechoslovakia. Finally, it discusses Agnoli's work in post-1968 West Germany and the work that has been developed within the framework of the Conference of Socialist Economists, CSE, in Britain since the 1980s by Simon Clarke, Werner Bonafelt, Richard Gunn, and John Holloway. Taking into account the complex history of the open Marxist tradition and the changes in the meaning of, quote, open Marxism that have occurred over time, the chapter argues that the development of the open Marxist tradition has to be understood as a process of critical interaction with prevailing socio-historical conditions and dialogue and other traditions and discourses, especially the early Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. The second chapter situates open Marxism as the last critique of mechanistic interpretations of Marx and outlines the open Marxist critique and rejection of institutional and orthodox Marxist positions. Open Marxist scholars argued against the, quote, positivization of Marxian thought and its metamorphosis into a, quote, scientific Weltanschauung, end quote, a complete and closed theoretical system. They rejected the, quote, base superstructure and, quote, model used by Marxist orthodoxy as a, quote, abstract universal framework, end quote, and severely criticized the Althusserian thinking that purports to make a distinction between the, quote, young and, quote, old Marx. The chapter elaborates on the open Marxist critique of Althusserianism and structural Marxism and maintains that open Marxists encompass Marx's writing as a whole. They understood both Marx's early and late writings as parts of the whole theoretical edifice and acknowledged that there is inherent unity in his work while admitting the contradictions, complexities, shortcomings, and limitations of Marxist thought. This chapter establishes a foundation for the following chapters by identifying and analyzing the critique of institutional Marxism as a common core feature in the work of open Marxist thinkers. The third chapter sets out to discuss how the negation of closed and dogmatic forms of Marxism led open Marxists to rereading and reassessment of Marxist thought. This critical return to Marx involved questioning the methodological uses of Marxist theorizing and investigating how Marx's mode of thinking could be employed and further developed in order to foster and advance the subversive critique of both the existing capitalist orders and the Stalinist regimes. The chapter focuses on how open Marxists developed the most radical anti-authoritarian and libertarian elements of Marxist thought. It critically discusses the distinctive features of open Marxist thought as it evolved through, quote, working and struggling, and, quote, with Marxian critical theory. It argues that the specificity of open Marxism's conception of the character and use of critique as negative, fundamental, and destructive constitutes common ground in the work of open Marxist thinkers throughout the tradition's history. The chapter scrutinizes the notion of critique, establishes connections, and identifies key differences in the thought of the members of this particular Marxist tradition. It goes on to argue that the concept of, quote, social form is at the core of the open Marxist critical tradition. Negative critique questions the outward appearance of economic categories and aims to investigate and reveal their social constitution. Open Marxist thinkers conceive of social phenomena and structures as, quote, forms, assumed during the process of class struggle, as, quote, appearances, or, quote, modes of existence, unquote, of the contradictory movement of antagonistic social relations, and in particular the capital-labor relation. Open Marxism lays particular emphasis on the concept of contradiction and considers dialectics as signaling a unity of opposites and a movement of contradiction. Criticism is thus understood as being an assault on identity, and Marxism is a theory of contradiction, a negative critique of the perverted social world, and a struggle against capitalist social relations, revealing the social genesis of a world governed by coins, things, and economic abstractions. Open Marxism's negativity amounts primarily to a critique of fetishism, an approach that deciphers and conceptualizes the convenient, quote, forgetting of societal constitution. The chapter concludes by focusing on the importance of human practice and the centrality of praxis for the open Marxist tradition. The fourth chapter argues that another shared common feature of open Marxist scholars is their opposition to the mythology that has been reproduced and perpetuated by the traditional left, and which conceives of the state and party as historically necessary institutions, both for the fight against capitalism and the creation of a socialist society. A key aspect of this approach is their position that the form of the party is a specifically and typically bourgeois type of political organization. The chapter focuses on open Marxism's thesis that the state is the political form of capitalist social relations. Open Marxism critically engages with debates about the critique of the political form of society that took place within the CSE Open Marxist group and draws out the social and political implications of their critical approaches. Open Marxists argue that the concept of socialist politics amounted to the self-organization and self-activity of the working class, and that autonomous class organization based on the utopia of the councils was the pivotal factor in the historical and social change. The fifth chapter expounds on how the negative critical theory of open Marxism can be used to build radical social praxis, with particular reference to the critique of class, labor, and economics. For open Marxists, class is not an affirmative category. It is essentially a critical concept in a negative category. By breaking with traditional and positivist interpretations of class as, quote, social groups, open Marxists argue against sociological analyses that view the concept of class as a, quote, thing and a, quote, structural position, end quote. The chapter discusses first the view that class is not a, quote, thing, but a definite social production relation, and that class relations, which are grounded in the extraction of surplus value occurring in the production process, are not purely economic. It then examines the position according to which the antagonism between capital and labor is not merely an economic but a social relationship. As part of an antagonistic struggle, class relations exist independently of individuals, yet also permeate and construct their lives, because class relations subsist in and through human beings. Open Marxism therefore manifests that class is a relation of struggle. The chapter goes on to investigate the assertion that class, as a negative and critical concept, is part of a reified society and belongs to a perverted world of social relations. Open Marxism does not call for a Marxist class theory. It calls for a critique and abolition of class society and for a critique of the capitalistically organized form of labor. Following the critical tradition associated with the work of Marx, Horkheimer, Adorno, and Pastone, open Marxism's critical theory developed the critique of abstract labor as a critical and fundamental element of the critique of political economy. The effort to develop the critique of political economy as a critical social theory entailed a critical rather than affirmative stance towards the conception of towards the concept of labor and the capitalist economic categories. In contrast to the tradition of institutional Marxism, in which the concept of labor was used as a positive ahistorical concept, open Marxism rejects the idea of socialist society as a, quote, well-ordered republic of labor, end quote. Finally, the chapter maintains that open Marxists argued against traditional Marxist theories that proposed the notion of a, quote, Marxist economics, end quote. They raise questions about the foundation of economic forms and viewed the critique of political economy as a theory of the social constitution of economic categories and of conceptualized human social practice. The critique of economics and economic categories reveals them as perverted forms of definite social relations and is historically formed and determined. In distinction to the orthodox Marxist view concerning the existence of a, quote, Marxist economic theory or, quote, Marxist political economy, end quote, open Marxists argue that the term, quote, Marxist political economy, end quote, is a contradiction in terms, since Marx always referred to his work as a critique of political economy. Finally, the last chapter explains how open Marxist thought advanced the work of the early Frankfurt School and of critical theory more generally, through its confrontation with traditional theory and Marxist orthodoxy. The chapter analyzes open Marxism's limits, legacy, and distinctive contribution to the revival and development of critical social theory and the struggle for truth, freedom, and a qualitatively different and new global human condition. Okay, so that's the end of the introduction to Open Marxism, Critical Theory as Militant Enlightenment by Christos Memos. Thank you so much for listening.